Your Excellency, the Executive Governor of Kano State, my brother Nasir Ahmed Arufai, Your Excellency, the Deputy Governor, members of the State Executive Council, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and pleasure for me to be here with you again at the Kaduna Investment Conference, which has become part of my own annual calendar, usually a marker for new trouble whenever I speak. Let me begin by congratulating the state for continuing with this extremely useful conference, and not just that, for making sure it's not a talk shop. Every year we see progress and actual implementation of decisions that are taken in previous conferences. And sometimes when one listens to these presentations, one wonders if one has anything really to add to what has been said and what has already been done. Be that as it may, I would like to make a few remarks on the theme of the conference, infrastructure, industrialization, and innovation, and just try to take a step back and see what we can learn from the history of our country and why we have stalled and what we may need to do and what we can learn from other countries as a guide to what at the national and subnational level we can and should expect and can and should work towards. So I've put together a few slides, and if we can go to the very first one, that slide, can we have the slides up? Okay, next slide, please. It's not there? Okay. I thought we should put this slide up so that we begin to, the question here is, why is Nigeria stalling? Why do we need private investment, and how much can we expect from government? I have a number of African countries on this slide: Angola, Botswana, Cote d'Ivoire, Egypt, Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Mauritius, Morocco, Nigeria, Tanzania, Uganda, and Zambia. And with each country we have the GDP per capita, but also tax revenues per capita and development spending per capita. Now, if you take Nigeria, this was 2019. Nominal GDP was 2.4 billion. That should be 240, I think, billion US dollars. GDP, $2,400 US dollars GDP per capita. Our tax revenues per capita was only $75, and our development spending was 36. This is at the federal level. Now compare this to Kenya, where the GDP per capita of 2,151, roughly 90% of Nigeria's per capita GDP. But Kenya was able to raise $280 per capita and invest $280 per capita on development. So Kenya, which has 90% of our per capita GDP, is able to raise 4 times as much in tax per capita and spend 7 times as much per capita on development. Now, these numbers are extremely important when we begin to hope that the federal government can give us development. I mean, for the federal government to get to a point where we are anywhere near where Kenya is doing, the government has to multiply its tax revenues per capita 4 times and also multiply its development spending 7 times. How long do states have to wait? And how long does the country have to wait for the government to raise these revenues and make these investments? So I think we need to be honest, at least in the short and medium term, and realize that the ability of government to steer this country into development is limited. in terms of spending, and its best option is to spend a lot of time on business environment reform and invite private sector investment into these areas. And next slide, please. Now, look at the states, and I see progress that's been made by Kaduna on IGR. At current oil prices, given the reports that we have, only 2 out of 36 states collect enough revenue to meet overheads. So there's a need to generate, to have internally generated revenue. There's a whole question of the tax regime, who controls the tax, is the federal or state government, the issue of multiple taxation, and therefore even where you have a determination and a willingness, there are certain constraints, legal, institutional, political constraints to that. But again, this further explains why we cannot rely just on the state governments to finance development. Now, one of the things we need to say is, why haven't we made progress, and what should we be doing, and look at the solutions. And we go back to our past. Let's take the next slide, please. What can our history tell us about the potential solutions for the current period of stagnation? Before there was oil, before we had Chinese loans, before independence, Nigeria's economy was both better diversified and consistently in a trade surplus. What we have here are more than 80 years pre-independence, for which records exist. Nigeria ran a trade surplus in all but 15 of those years. In all but 15 of more than 80 years, we had trade surpluses with the rest of the world, and in many years, the surpluses were meaningful. So, if we want to understand where we should be going, and maybe, I suppose Kaduna has already understood it, but further encourage us on the path we have taken, we need to look at the past and say, what did we lose in the post-independence period? Next slide. Why was Nigeria successful in the pre-oil period? It was diversification, dynamism in trading sector, and diversity of export base. Look at rubber, cocoa, palm oil, ivory, hides, palm kernels, groundnuts, cotton, tin ore, and so on. Because diversity meant the country was less vulnerable to terms of trade shock, driven by only one export. And for those of us in our generation, those of us who have grown up in the oil period, we've suffered, I think, on about 3 or 4 occasions now, this boom and bust that's come with the price of oil. We have seen highs and lows. We've seen friends who have become multimillionaires and paupers. We have seen people who sent their children abroad to school only to bring them back. In fact, even this year, people are bringing their children back. If your child is in the UK and you have to buy pounds sterling at over 600 naira, you move him to Cyprus and maybe to Niger, and to Republic of Benin, Cotonou, and so on. Because this is a reality. It affects us in a direct and personal way. And I think one of the most important things a government needs to do is to understand the impact of wrong economic decisions or adverse economic occurrences on the human being and the individual. I keep saying that most people do not look at the human beings. We look at all these numbers. Inflation has gone up by X% or by 2%, and we just walk away. Break down the CPI. Go down to food, go down to what people eat on a daily basis, and think of the millions of people who can no longer afford to eat. And then 2% becomes a massive number, and a serious number. GDP has declined by 1%. In an exam, you move from 67% to 66%, it's no deal. It's no big deal. Your GDP falls by 1%. If your GDP is $250 billion, that is $2.5 billion of income wiped out. If you think of $2.5 billion in terms of human beings that are earning 20, 30,000 naira per month, how many millions of Nigerians are wiped out, and how many families have become poor? So these numbers are extremely important, and getting economic decisions right, the big decisions, will continue to be critical to the welfare of our people. So you have this diversity. We also had significant value addition in places like Kano. You had value addition to leather. You had value addition to cotton. Kaduna, the same thing. And this was the secret of pre-independence Nigeria. But even that had certain limitations. We had diversity, but this diversity was within commodity exports. And as we know from development theory, over the long term, the terms of trade shift against primary exporters. And therefore, any country that's in the global environment, any country that is operating on a global scale needs to move away and diversify not just its product base, but diversify away from primary production to secondary and tertiary sectors. And I chose one country that's broadly similar to Nigeria over a 30-year period to give us an example of what other countries have done. Next slide, please. This is Malaysia. This was Malaysia in 1970 and Malaysia in 2000. I have used a color code just so that visually you can see how Malaysian exports have transformed over a 30-year period. On the far left, you have crude rubber, you have coke and wood. Between them, in 1970, they contributed about 55%, almost 60% of Malaysian GDP. Now look at that color on the next slide after 30 years. The blue, electric machinery apparatus, office machines and automatic data processing, telecoms, products manufacturing. On the right, by 2000, had become over 27 now plus 21, 48, that's 60% of the exports of Malaysia. Now if you look at the left, that same color, 30 years before in 1970, all those sectors contributed less than 2% of exports. This is a 30-year period where one country in Asia had done this. In this period, Malaysian GDP per capita increased from $310 to $4,045. So it was growth plus diversification, but also diversification into higher value areas of the GDP. Now, I don't want to be a party spoiler, but next slide, please. This is Nigeria. This is Nigerian exports between 1985 and 2015, in the same 30 years. We also have 30 years. Do you see any change visually? Do I need to say anything? We have not moved. This is the difference between us and Asia. Nothing else. They moved. Please go back to the other slide. I think it's important. Just look at it. Go back, previous slide, Malaysia. One slide back. Just look at this. And then come back to Nigeria. Next slide. No. So, and in this period, interestingly, Nigeria's GDP per capita also increased from $345 to $2,655. So we were growing, but we did not diversify. That's one. And that explains the huge levels of poverty in the country. It explains the huge levels of inequality in the country. It explains the vulnerability of the economy to shocks in terms of trade. It also explains the relatively slow pace of growth, because when we started, when Malaysia started, it started from a GDP per capita level lower than Nigeria's GDP per capita in 1985. It started from $310 to over $4,000. We've started from 345 to what, $2,055. And now when you add inflation and add devaluation and begin to look at purchasing power parity, the GDP per capita numbers actually look inflated. And next slide, please. So one way to look at it is also to understand the difference between production and consumption. So take one example, smartphones. Many of us think because we have a widespread use of a smartphone, we have leapfrogged, we are developing. But there are people who are consumers of technology and people who are producers of technology. We've had all these investments in towers, we've had broadband, we've had internet. What have we done with it? Have we used it to produce, or have we been consumers? You pick up your phone, which is produced in China. You go on the internet. You order a product, a pair of shoes produced in France. It comes to you at home. What are you consuming? You're consuming the smartphone, you're consuming the shoes, you're creating income for those who produce the smartphones and those who produce the shoes. What really have you gained? So what we count as progress just opens us up just new and newer ways of intensifying the marginalization of countries and turn us into consumers of products. Now compare this, for example, to someone who picks up the smartphone and then produces a Nollywood movie and then uses the smartphone to distribute the movie. That is production. So we think, we've got all these investments, and that's why I like this about technology. Got all these investments in technology. We need now to invest in the human capital to have the innovation. There is enough investment in towers, enough investment in networks, and the federal government says we're going to invest in broadband with the ESP. Fine. What can Kaduna State do to produce young people in Kaduna State who know better than pick up the mobile phone to send WhatsApp messages to their friends and forward gossips and stories? Who realize that this phone in their hand is actually a ticket to wealth. I think for me this has been the difference between us and the Asians, between us and the Malaysians and the Indonesians. And I keep telling people all the time, try and read. There's this interesting book by, I think, Peter Lewis. It's called Growing Apart. I believe we discussed this. It's amazing. You just look at how Nigeria and Indonesia, every excuse Nigeria has for not developing, Indonesia has. They have a large population, they are multi-ethnic, multi-religious, they have had civil wars, they have had military dictatorships, they have even had corruption. Corruption is our excuse. Suharto, Malaysia has had massive corruption. Why did Malaysia develop? This was the difference. Move away from being a consumer of technology to a producer. Move away from a consumer attitude to electricity, to production. We invest billions and billions of dollars in a national grid. Invest billions in transmission. Invest billions in distribution. Bring electricity to you. What is it for? To watch Arsenal and Manchester United. To have air conditioning. A fan. Whereas for others, every electron of electricity delivered makes you a carpenter, an electrician, an artisan. fires your generator for irrigation. For every naira you spend on electricity, you are earning 10, 20 naira. That's why at very low levels of poverty, income elasticity is far, far more important than price elasticity. People would pay anything for electricity if they knew how to turn electricity into an earning capacity. When people cry, it's because they are paying for power and earning nothing from it. If you go to a village and give a man electricity and he's paying 100 naira per kilowatt hour, and he can turn that if he has a small freezer and his wife is making kununzaki and he is selling, and every month he's spending X thousand on electricity and making 4 times more from selling kununzaki, he's happy. He'll pay twice to get the next freezer. And when we focus on, and that's why these things about tariff reviews and tariff conversation, I think the government is not having that conversation in a manner that convinces people. People need to understand that you complain about tariffs because you're thinking of tariffs only from a consumption perspective. If you look at electricity as a critical input into production, into productivity, into earnings, if you look at electricity as an economic resource, look at how much money you could make. There's a difference between not earning a thing and earning something. It's the difference between extreme poverty and rising above the poverty line. You know, the Chinese, I spoke to a Chinese economist one day, and he said, you know, forget all these numbers. The Chinese government has always focused on only 2 numbers: the number of Chinese at work and the number of Chinese who have electricity. Because electricity per capita is such a critical determinant for moving people out of poverty. And so for me, I think we need to interrogate our mindset. We need to think over and over again as to how we understand economics, how we understand what we see. How do we understand technology? How do we understand electricity? Are we consumers or are we producers? And what I think Kaduna State is doing and what we need to continue, and that's why investment in human capital is so important. Produce young men who know that they are worth more than just using their telephone to import a pair of shoes. To know that this is something that they can use. And they've got ideas. Encourage them, have incubation centers, and then scale these ideas up. And that's how, in no time, you're then not worried about waiting for oil money. You're not worried about going to FAC. You're not worried about looking for handouts from the federal government. In fact, they will not be interested in whether the governor is spending money on this or spending money on that. So long as you create that environment and give them the skills, they will take advantage of what you have. So the development of infrastructure has become so much decoupled from technological training. We've had this need for quick cost solutions. We just go and buy towers, mainly from China, and then there are no skills transfers. So as I said, the federal government in the CSP says we're going to have broadband penetration. I read the document. We're going to deal with Google, we're going to deal with Facebook, and it's fantastic. But are you going to have broadband in Nigeria just so that people can continue doing the same thing? WhatsApp? Or should we take advantage of this anti-COVID process of investing in broadband, but this time understanding that this is an economic resource, and building at every point in this country where we supply technology, what can we build on it? How can we give digital education to rural areas? How can we use technology to deliver healthcare, primary healthcare to the rural areas? How can we use technology to train young people in robotics? How do we leapfrog? You know, we keep thinking about reindustrialization, and we're thinking in the 1960s. You want to go back? We can't go back to the groundnut pyramids. If you build groundnut pyramids in Kano today, they're not going to impress anyone in the world. In the 60s, they were great. In 2010, when people are going to Mars, groundnut pyramids, is that really the limit of our ambition? history was good, but we can't go back into it. I know Kaduna would like to revive all those textiles, and it's great to have the textiles, but maybe when we build the textiles, we should ask how many people are wearing African prints compared to how much we spend on suits and shirts and ties and underwear. Are those not the kind of textiles we should be looking at? Garments? Or do we go back to reproducing textiles that were for a market in the 1950s and 60s? In other words, yes, our resource endowments are important, but what determines where we focus should be where is the market, where is the world today? And it's really Generation Z. What do they want? What are they buying? What are they interested in? Next slide, please. So if you look at, it was a structural change in Southeast Asia, movement from agriculture to formal manufacturing and services. In Africa, all of Africa, apart from South Africa maybe, the bulk of the transmission has been basically informal movement from agriculture, manufacturing, services. That's the bulk. They're all in the informal sector. The really organized sector has been manufacturing. But look at manufacturing and how we have underemphasized it, given the fact that it's much higher value than primary production. Manufacturing GDP in Africa has fallen from 14% to 10%, from 40% in 1990 to 10% today. But manufacturing continues to employ 8 to 9% of Africans. What does that mean? We have been having decline in productivity, while the rest of the world has been increasing productivity. If you had these same numbers for the United States, you would see manufacturing as a fraction of GDP increasing and as an employer decreasing, because we need to, and that again goes back to the same point, human capital, the productivity of the human beings. So it's not just enough to go into manufacturing. If you go into manufacturing and productivity is going down, you will not have the GDP. Summary, parts of Africa continue to grow very quickly, but without a more enlightened industrial policy, this growth will not translate into meaningful job creation. It's got to be, you've got to think through it. You've got to make sure that your projects are linked. You don't just build a road here, a rail line there, an airport there, without knowing how they're going to translate into an economy. Ethiopia has a fantastic airport. So it says, okay, fine, we've got these airlines that fly every day to Europe. You can have a fantastic flower business. Right there in Addis, you harvest, put them on a plane, the same day they're being sold on the streets of London. Okay? Now you plant your flowers in Jos. For them to go to London, you have to move from Jos to Kaduna, from Kaduna maybe to Lagos, move them through traffic. By the time the flowers by the time they get to London, they're withered. So even when we build airports, it shouldn't just be because people want to fly from Abuja to Kano for a wedding. Really, you follow the economy, follow the money in investing in infrastructure and put everything together. Now you go to these countries, you land at an airport, you've got your train station there, you've got your bus station, and generally you move from one economic zone to another. And yes, in the course of your journey, there'll be residential areas. As people get on a light train from central Kaduna to go to work in the factory, there will be those who are going for naming ceremonies and weddings, but you're not building the train for people who are going to go for naming ceremonies and weddings, because the train will not even pay its way back. People need to go and earn something anyway to pay the fares. So this is in Kaduna. It's more or less preaching to the converted. Like I said, when I was invited to join the Investment Promotion Authority, I said, well, look, you guys have done so well. I don't know how much value I have to add, but I'll take it as an honorary appointment, just like you take an honorary doctorate. Public debt has risen. We all know the fiscal position of government is not strong. We're spending huge percentage of our revenue on servicing debt. You have a high rate of inflation. The central bank is reaching the limit of its balance sheet. Honestly, I don't see how much more the central bank can continue to expand its balance sheet. And we are seeing the consequences in inflation. We're seeing the consequences in exchange rate. So we should not put so much pressure on the central bank. We should not have so many expectations on the government. And the government should not itself take upon itself responsibilities it cannot take. You can't continue borrowing and sinking us into indebtedness to provide development today. Spend more time creating the environment, spend more time on reforms, spend more time attracting local and foreign investment while you fix your balance sheet and then are able to prepare. So in the absence of tighter lending standards from China, it's up to African policymakers to ensure that borrowed money is put to productive use. And the criteria should be recombinant value instead of immediate raw material availability. So these are my thoughts generally, and I hope that I've added something to the context of the conversation without being I'm trying to avoid being specific these days. It keeps me out of trouble, so nobody can say I'm talking about. Thank you.